Peter Singer is an Australian-born philosopher who specializes in applied ethics. His controversial views have earned him the title of, quote, the most popular living philosopher, as well as, quote, the most dangerous one. He is the founding father of the modern animal rights movement. His views on euthanasia, abortion, and the sanctity of human life have caused much debate in academic and non-academic circles. In 1999, he was appointed professor of bioethics at Princeton University's Center for Human Values. His arrival on campus was followed by protest and loud reaction in the media and on campuses across the country. His new book, Writings on an Ethical Life, is a collection of his most provocative writings and his attempt to explain directly his central ideas. I am pleased to have him on this program for the first time. Welcome. It's great to have you here.
It's good to be here.
We've been trying to do this for a while, so I'm pleased to have you here, even though you come at a moment in which America's eyes seem to be focused not on philosophy, but how many votes we can count.
That's right. I guess can always happen in a democracy. You have to count to the last vote.
As a philosopher, what do you tell me? Give you any sense of a point of view on what's going on in Florida?
I guess I have a couple of things. One is that, to me, in a sense, Gore ought to have won this election on the assumption that most of the people who voted for Nader would have preferred Gore over Bush. Now, in Australia, we have a transferable vote system, a preferential system.
Right.
So those people could have written 1 Nader, 2 Gore, presumably, right, 3 Bush. And presumably most of the people who voted for Nader would have done that. So in Florida, those 90-odd thousand votes that went for Nader would have gone at least 60-30, I imagine, for Gore, and he would have ended up 30,000 votes ahead. So I think, in a sense, you know, not only did he win the popular vote, but he also has a moral claim to the presidency on the basis that the minor party that took away most votes is clearly more to his side of politics than to Bush's.
What if someone argued the other side, which is we have rules which create standards and expectations, and people have to play by the rules, and you can't change the rules, and all of the arguments that are being made by the Bush folks as to why Bush has won the electoral votes in Florida?
Well, I think you have to ask whether those rules are fair rules. Now, it's true that you have them.
Then change them for the next time, they would argue.
That's right. You should, yeah, that's true. But still, if you're asking, if you get down to something that is on a few hundred votes, and you have possibilities of challenging the recounts or whether a ballot was confusing, then I think it's reasonable to look at the larger picture as well and to say, look, the rules are open to different interpretations here, but an interpretation that does substantial justice would be better than one that doesn't.
Why did you become a philosopher?
I was interested in debate and argument and something that really makes a difference to the way we live. I guess I felt I wanted to be able to explore these large questions that in other areas get pushed to one side, and philosophy gives you the chance to talk about those things.
Okay, so but here philosophy, that explains philosophy. Was there something about ethics itself that was appealing to you?
Well, ethics is the most practical side of philosophy. It's the bit that makes a difference, right? I mean, I was doing other areas of philosophy where, for example, you talk about how do we know that anything is real, right? How do we know this is a table here, right? And that's kind of interesting because it's amazing how good an argument you can find for saying, well, we can't really be sure that this is a table. We could both be dreaming, or I could be having this dream that I'm on Charlie Rose. Right. So I don't really know it. But in a sense, however good that argument is, it's not going to make a difference the way you live, right? Exactly. I'm not going to hold this glass because there may not be a table there and it might just drop through. We know what's going to happen. In ethics, on the other hand, what you do really makes a difference to the way you live, to what you eat, for example, to what you think you ought to do with your life, to the views that you have on a range of issues. So that's something that matters and isn't just an intellectual problem. And that's why I went into ethics.
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, my next question was why applied ethics, and you just answered that too.
Right, that's right. I was interested in ethics as a whole, but it's the applied side of it that has more of those connections with real life.
Yeah. The application, I mean, is philosophy heard in America, do you think? Is your work heard?
I think it is. Not everyone writing in philosophy is heard. I think I've been fortunate to be heard. And in a sense, oddly enough, my opponents who've criticized me and as you said in your introduction, made a lot of fuss when I first came to Princeton, made sure that my arrival in America was known and that people have been reading my work. And there have been a number of other philosophers, obviously, John Rawls, Robert Nozick, these are well-known names. But there's a lot of good people, of course, who write good stuff that doesn't get across. And that's a difference between American culture and, say, French or Italian culture, where I think there is less of a gap between the intellectual life and popular.
It's certainly true about philosophy in France,
yeah.
you would argue.
Yeah.
I mean, I assume you would argue that.
I would, and I mean, philosophers are kind of celebrities in France in a way that
That's
just
exactly
never
my
happens
point.
here.
Yeah. More than any society I know. I
Yeah.
don't know what that says about the French, and how far back it goes, but it's certainly true. Let me just stay with you. Some would argue that you're more politician than philosopher. Because you really want to use this to a certain end.
I do want to use it to a certain end, but I also want to get the arguments out there. And I think the characteristic of a politician is that they're only concerned with whether what they're saying advances their goal. Now, let me give you an example. George Will, who of course has very different views from me on the abortion issue, wrote in his Newsweek column after he interviewed me that I was the pro-abortion side's nightmare. Right now, I am pro-abortion. I favour women's right to have an abortion, but he thinks that what I've been saying is actually harmful to that cause, because I'm prepared to actually say that the implications of the case for abortion do have consequences for our views about infant life as well, and that birth doesn't make such a crucial difference to the status of the fetus/baby and whether it has a right to life. Now, if I were a politician, I wouldn't be saying that. I would be thinking, gee, this could harm the pro-choice movement.
Or said another way, give them an inch and they'll take a mile.
That's right. And so I have to somehow fudge that argument. And I don't want to do that. I guess I have sort of some kind of confidence that getting the arguments out there in the long run will lead to the best outcomes.
You have that confidence?
I guess I do. You may think that this is naive, but maybe it will take a very long run.
I've often been accused of naivete, so it's okay with me. But I mean, you really do believe that somehow that in sort of the intelligence of the public at large,
My faith can be shaken sometimes, but I do, in the end, yes, I do believe that those arguments are going to get sorted out and that we are going to move in the right direction.
So we should not necessarily always engage in such self-editing as we speak.
No, that's right. I think that you shouldn't just be thinking about the short term. You should be thinking about the longer run as well, and trying to have a fair and honest exchange of views.
Where do you think the abortion argument is going to go?
I think that the abortion argument has to be seen in the context of a whole lot of sanctity of life issues, as I call them.
Go ahead.
And those issues, I think, are going in the way that is forcing people to face up to change. The technological drive, the ability of medical care to keep human beings alive when their lives have ceased to have any of the things we value about human life, forces physicians and families to make choices. And we've tried in a way to disguise those, to draw a fig leaf over them, and to pretend that in those choices we are not actually abandoning the traditional view of the sanctity of human life. But I think that can only last so long, and I think that we are increasingly facing up to the fact that we do make choices to end human lives, and that it's really okay to do that. In fact, it's the only thing to do in certain circumstances. And once we do that, we are going to start reassessing this traditional ethic, which at the moment leads people to think that abortion is wrong, and that...
Because it's a taking of life.
Because it's a taking of life, exactly.
Yeah. But as you think, if we get at the other end of life and come to the hard choices there, that somehow will influence our decision about...
I think it will, that's right. I think we'll see. I mean, we've now had for some years a law in Oregon that allows allows doctors to assist people to end their lives. Maine quite...
Well, but stop in Oregon. Has it changed their perception of abortion at all? I mean, has it changed any terms of public opinion about abortion?
I couldn't say that it has in Oregon specifically, but I guess what I'm saying is that as these things become more widely accepted, and I think they will, it will contribute to that change.
I'm going to obviously want to get to animal rights, but what is the fundamental core that cuts across? And maybe it's a sanctity. Well, as soon as I say that, I know it's not. What is the fundamental philosophy is at the core of what you believe that cuts across all the issues?
I think fundamentally it's a desire to avoid needless pain and suffering. And I guess that's what I see in the case of the animal issue, that we're inflicting a lot of unnecessary pain and suffering on animals. That's what I see in the euthanasia issue, for example, that people who want to die, who are in pain and distress, are not able to decide for themselves when they've had enough. That's what I see in the case of the practice of allowing some severely disabled infants to die slowly by non-treatment rather than being prepared to assist them to die. And that's what I see in the issue of the refusal of the wealthy nations to share at least some of their wealth with the poorest nations, where people are suffering and dying and their children are dying because they can't get basic medical care, basic medicines that cost really just cents.
Animal rights. How did you get involved?
I got involved
Some say you're the father of the modern animal rights movement.
I've been called that. Obviously, there are a lot of people who contributed to it, and if I played a role, I'm pleased to have done so. I got involved really as a result of a quite accidental meeting with a Canadian graduate student, a man named Richard Keshen, who was a fellow student of mine when I was a graduate student at Oxford, and who was a vegetarian before I'd really started thinking about the issue. And so I had lunch with him, and he refused a dish that had meat in it. And I said, why aren't you eating that? And he said, well, I don't really think that we have the right to treat animals the way we do just in order to turn them into food when we don't need it. And it wasn't that he said, that he had some idea of the sanctity of life, that it was always wrong to kill any living thing. I don't think that would have interested me. And it wasn't that he said he was doing it for his health, but his idea, that somehow we humans are treating a whole class of other beings in a certain way just as things for us to use, and essentially challenging me to say, well, what is it that gives us humans the right to do that? Why is it that we would never think of treating other humans as beings to fatten for food, right. Exactly. And yet, just because you're not a member of our species, we can do what we like to you. We can lock you up in dark sheds, we can put you in stalls or crates where you can't even turn around, we can put you in cages, if it makes it a little bit cheaper to produce your meat or eggs, we can do just about anything to you. And at first I thought, well, that's an interesting philosophical puzzle. Let's try and find why it is that humans are so different, that we can do these things, that we are justified in treating animals this way but not humans. But the more I looked and I started reading what philosophers had said or not said, because a lot of them just ignored the issue, and the more I looked for a real key that would justify what we were doing, the harder it got to find it, until eventually I just said, well, I guess he was really right. What's going on here is something like what was going on in the days of racism, when people just failed to see that the fact that a being was a member of another race didn't mean that you're entitled to treat them as things, to load them onto ships, to use them as instruments for your means to work the plantations.
Okay, but I mean, you actually find that parallel is accurate for you, that it is parallel to racism in terms of how we treat another species, and that all the arguments that be made, both in terms of the nobility of the purpose, not just food, say, for medical experimentation on the one hand, or B, the levels of intelligence, etc., they fall on deaf ears as far as you're concerned.
Well, let me say firstly, I do think that the analogy with racism is there. I don't say it's the whole story. I'm not saying that they're precisely, shall we say, on all fours here. Right. But I do think that what's common is you have a dominant group which has the power to exploit an inferior group, and which gives itself everything that is valuable, everything that is important, and denies it to the other beings. It's an ideology that is convenient, which we have developed in ourselves, and just as with racism, you can trace it back through history and you can find the texts that are used to justify this. So I think there is that analogy. In terms of the differences that you mentioned about differences of intelligence, of course they're there. I don't deny for a moment. No non-humans could have the conversation that we're now having. But what's important is that we do not think in the case of human beings, the lack of that ability justifies us in using a human either for food or for research purposes, to experiment on, to test our medicines. We do not think in the case of a human that being of less intelligence than us, being unable to have an abstract conversation about ideas, would justify us in doing that. So I don't think we can claim that the boundary we're drawing between humans and animals is a boundary between beings with a certain level of rationality
so
and beings that are not.
The variance that you can solve.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. It's not what's doing the work.
What gives you the hardest problem? I mean, because some would argue in some way, whatever they use, intelligence or some other basis, that it is in the end the point you make about the parallel to racism and other points you make are an insult to the human species, or an insult to the human species, failing to come to appreciate the distinction and the difference.
Well, it's not that I don't appreciate the distinctions between beings with higher levels of rationality and beings with lower levels of rationality.
And self-awareness and
I do,
so many other things.
I do, and I prize that. And I think it makes a difference sometimes. For example, I think the wrongness of killing a being is related to its capacity for self-awareness, because that gives it an internal view of its life. It can lead a biographical life, as the philosopher James Rachels has said, rather than a purely biological life. So self-awareness makes a difference when it comes to killing. But a few moments ago you asked me, what was the common thread between my ideas, and I said suffering. So you don't need to be self-aware to have the capacity to feel pain or to suffer. And those are the things, I think, that we need to consider, and we need to give equal weight to suffering, whether it's a member of the human species or a member of another species. And that's what we fail to do.
I don't know how much thought you've given to this, but back to my question about what's the common theme, and you said suffering. Where does that come from, you think? I mean, why is it that's so paramount in your own conception of things? Where does it, in your own history, in your
philosophically or psychologically, you're asking
in your own biography?
Well,
what is it about Peter Singer that gave this heightened sense of suffering so that it became a central link to important ideas that he wanted to engage?
In some way, it's always seemed obvious to me that that we suffer, pain is bad, we try and avoid it, and if other beings can suffer, that's bad, and we should also avoid it. But I don't know, psychologically, I sometimes get asked whether, what it is in my background, and I guess one answer that I sometimes give is that my family came to Australia as refugees from Austria, family of Jewish background. And their parents did not leave in time, tragically, and 3 of them died in Nazi camps. And I think growing up just after the war with that sort of vivid sense of what the Nazis had done to the people, Jewish people in particular, but of course to other people in Europe, and the way in which a dominant group without ethical restraints can do those terrible things to people who are in their power, has made me feel that that's really a very important thing to try and stop people who simply have the sheer power to use others and indeed to torture others, to try and make sure that they can't do that.
How do we, when we get to the question of morality and morals, I mean, how do we calculate morals? How do we measure them? Is there some kind of moral economics?
In theory, there's a moral economics, perhaps, but there's no tools for actually measuring it.
What moral right is above another moral right?
I think what we ought to be doing is actually something very ancient and something represented in a lot of different religious as well as non-religious traditions, and that is to put yourself in the position of the others affected. So it's something like, doing to your neighbour as you would like them to do to you, but imagining really what it's like to be your neighbour and what it's like to be all of your neighbours, or for that matter, the strangers who are also affected by what you're doing.
Kind of a golden rule?
Yes, it is a golden rule. And insofar as it's a measure, it's saying put yourself in the position of all of those affected and in some way try and weigh that up. What would you rather have happen if you had to live not just your own life, but you also had to live the life of everyone else who is affected by the choice that you make? That's the closest that I can come to a measure of what's the right thing to do.
As we have this conversation, I promise you, at least 30% of the people in the audience are saying, ask him about religion.
I'm not a religious person. As I said, my family was of Jewish background, but my parents were also not particularly religious. I've never felt the need for religious belief, and I have to say I've never felt the plausibility of believing that a world like this could have been created by, or could be being overseen by, a kind of divine providence who is both good and all-knowing and all-powerful. I mean, it doesn't make sense to me that a being who is good and all-powerful could allow a world with this much unnecessary suffering.
Does that make you
continue.
an atheist or an agnostic or something?
I'm prepared
undefined?
to say that I'm an atheist. I mean, if you want to be technical...
But it's incalculable for you to imagine that there is somebody who's all-powerful, who would allow a world so full of the pain and suffering and evil that we see.
About that kind of God, I simply cannot believe that such a God could exist. I mean, if people want to talk about other kinds of spiritual elements, I would probably say then I become agnostic. I can't prove that they don't exist or have a really strong argument. But against that traditional Judeo-Christian conception of God, I do think that the problem of suffering is still an insoluble one.
How different is this society, and the American society, say, from other areas of the world? You know, how these values play here versus Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe?
It's really quite different. It is a unique culture, and even coming from Australia, which seems in some way a similar English-speaking culture, former British colony, it's still quite different. And one of the big differences is what we were just talking about. It's a much more religious society than
we are.
Yes, the
founded
United
off
States
religious.
Is. That's right.
The search for religious freedom.
And still is. And it comes up all the time, and it influences arguments, and you know, it's a major factor clearly why abortion was a big issue in the presidential campaign, as it is in every election here. In Australia, it's not an issue at all, because you know, there's no votes on the whole in saying that you're opposed to abortion in Australia. So you know, those issues are not really forceful issues in the same way that they are here. That's the major difference, I guess, that I notice. So.
I have friends of mine who will argue with me, political friends, that we are a center-right country. Do you believe that? With all the common definition of what that might mean, as you and I both know.
I don't find the United States very close to the center. I would say it's on the right. I don't regard the United States politics as central by either Australian or European standards. I mean, just the fact that you know.
The socialist would be central. I mean, I would assume that a social democracy would be center for you if you look at it that way.
Right. I mean, to me, to be center is to have, for example, universal health coverage for every citizen.
That's a central point.
That's a central point. That's not a left-wing point to me. I mean, left-wing points position would be to have you know, public ownership of other industries, but the provision of basic health care, basic social security, I mean, they're things that in the countries that I've lived in, Australia and Britain, they have been taken for granted. And they are not opposed even by the conservative political parties. I mean, there is no political party in Australia or in England or in, you know, the major Western European countries that wants to say we should take away from everyone the right to universal health coverage.
As soon as you argue that, I will tell you my personal belief that social democratic parties in Europe are moving to the center. You know, in terms of where the politics of those places go. The Labour Party of Tony Blair is not the Labour Party.
It's certainly not. No.
Of the past.
No, it's not. But it is still not considering abandoning things like universal health coverage.
And so-called third way is where they...
That's right, yeah. So that's why I think the United States is further over. And you look at a whole lot of issues. I mean, you look at the global climate change issue, which is the conference that has just collapsed in The Hague. It was the United States that was really holding out. That was the obstacle to finding a solution there. The European nations were in agreement that something has to be done. The United States was saying, you know, and I think this was the line that George W. Bush was taking in the debates, that we won't do anything unless China and India come in. You know, I mean, that's a crazy position, given that the United States is putting 20 times as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere per capita as India is.
What's the best thing about America?
I think the best thing about America is that Americans really do take ethics seriously. They take ideals seriously. They would like to do the right thing, and they will debate hard what is the right thing to do. They're not blasé or cynical like some Europeans are, some Australians are, and that's great. You know, that's an enthusiasm. That's something that has to be welcomed. But I just wish on some of these issues the debate would actually go in a different way.
You know what it does? It makes it a great land for philosophers.
It does, really. It does. And I really love teaching my students at Princeton because they are so enthusiastic to get to grips with these issues. You know, they have their own views and they will defend them forcefully, and that's terrific. But they take the issues very, very seriously.
I assume that you are still an Australian citizen.
I am, yes.
You think about becoming a naturalized American?
Well, I haven't been here that long yet. I'm not thinking about it at the moment. You know, give it time.
As a friend of mine used to tell you, I'll jump off that bridge when I get to it.
That's about it. Yeah, that's right. I'm not there yet.
Writings on an Ethical Life by Peter Singer. My thanks for you coming here. Pleasure.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you.
Back in a moment. Stay with us.